Welcome to the deep dive. So we've got this really interesting source material from you, including a discussion with political analyst Behrouz Partovi.
hmm
And our mission today is, well, to take that deep dive into the Iranian regime's world. We're looking at the nuclear talks, the internal fights, the battle for influence.
Basically trying to get behind the headlines.
Exactly. Cut through the noise, find the key insights, and figure out what's really going on based on these sources.
Okay, so where do we start? The source material really flags this confusing sequence of events just recently.
Yeah.
You had Shamkhani, right?
Yeah.
Described as close to Khamenei.
Right, a key advisor.
Around mid-May, maybe the 14th, 16th, something like that, he apparently put forward proposals suggesting they might actually start enriching uranium.
If sanctions were lifted, that sounds like a pretty big shift, potentially.
It does, but then, just a few days later, maybe the 17th, Khamenei himself reacts publicly. And it's a hard no, a really sharp rejection of any limits on enrichment, any inspections, just completely contradicts Shamkhani.
Wow. Okay, so that's a very public split.
It is. And the source argues this contradiction tells you something fundamental. It paints a picture of the regime as not unified at all.
Like internal factions.
Exactly. The source uses terms like rotted mafia factions. It suggests they're working against each other sometimes, that there isn't this strong central control we might assume.
Interesting. So, okay, let's step back. Why are these negotiations even happening? Why are they so vital for the regime, according to this material?
Well, the source makes a strong argument that, look, for 47 years, this regime hasn't really paid a price for what the source calls its crime.
Things like crimes against humanity, massacres, terrorism.
Right. All of that. They argue the regime has survived partly because of, appeasement from the outside and tactics like hostage-taking, stirring up conflict in the region.
So they've avoided real consequences.
Pretty much. And this allowed them to build up what the source calls their strategic depth.
The strategic depth. Okay, what does that mean in practical terms? The source mentions two main pillars.
Yeah, two core pillars. First, their network of proxy forces, Hezbollah, Assad in Syria, the Houthis, groups like that.
And the source says this network has been weakened recently.
Significantly weakened, yeah. They trace it back to around October 2023, and they see this weakening as a major strategic defeat for the regime.
Okay, so that's one pillar getting shaky. What's the second one?
The second one is the atomic bomb project. This is presented as the other core strategic goal.
Khamenei sees it as essential for survival, a deterrent.
That's the view attributed to him, yes, absolutely essential. But the source really pushes back on this.
How so?
They argue it's a huge miscalculation, historically speaking. Look at the Soviet Union. Thousands of nukes still collapse.
Or Israel reportedly having bombs, but not necessarily stability.
Exactly. Or Gaddafi. He had military power, but look what happened. The source suggests nukes aren't this magic survival guarantee Khamenei thinks they are.
And the cost. The source mentioned the cost.
Oh, yeah. Immense. Over $2 trillion reportedly spent on the nuclear project.
$2 trillion.
Yeah. And the source claims that's more than Iran's entire oil revenue since oil was even discovered there.
That's staggering. And despite all that spending, they haven't actually finished it yet.
Not yet, according to the source, partly because of these revelations that keep coming out over the years, exposing parts of the program.
Which brings us back to the current negotiations. What exactly is on the table right now? What are the international demands, according to the source?
Okay, the source outlines some key things. First, a complete stop to enrichment. Zero enrichment, they call it.
Zero. Okay.
Second, proper regular inspections.
Zero bust ones. Makes sense.
Third, they need to get rid of the uranium they've already enriched above the limits. Specifically, they mention 275 kilograms, over 60% enrichment.
And the source says that level only has military uses.
Purely military, yes, that's the claim. And finally, they want to talk about the missile program, too.
So, if you put that all together, these demands aren't just technical tweaks. They're hitting that second strategic pillar, the nuclear one.
That's exactly how the source frames it. They're essentially forcing the regime to confront abandoning its second major strategy.
Right when the first one, the proxies, is already in trouble.
Precisely. All happening in a pretty short time frame, less than 2 years, according to this analysis.
So, okay, if the demands are that tough, hitting their core strategies, why did they even agree to negotiate? The source said they came on bloody knees.
Yeah, that's the phrasing used. The argument is their main goal wasn't really to make a deal, it was simply to buy time.
Buy time. Why is time so critical right now?
It's presented as absolutely crucial. There's this massive external deadline, the trigger mechanism. It's set for October 2025.
That's the thing that snaps back all the old UN sanctions automatically.
Exactly, if the nuclear deal expires or they violate it. And legally, it needs to be triggered a couple of months before, like July or August 2025.
And the regime is terrified of that happening.
Hugely. Avoiding that snapback was a major reason they signed the original JCPOA in 2015, the source argues. So delaying past that trigger point is vital for them.
So buying time for that external deadline?
Mm-hmm.
But you also mentioned internal pressures.
Oh, absolutely. The source describes the domestic situation as explosive,
Meaning?
widespread economic pain, power cuts, water shortages, massive unemployment, prices through the roof. There's this constant risk of, well, another major uprising.
So the regime thinks buying time, even a few weeks.
Might let them get some sanctions relief, maybe just enough to ease the pressure at home a little bit, calm things down, and maybe push that trigger mechanism deadline further away.
And that contradiction we started with, Shawkani versus Khamenei, how does that fit in?
The source sees it as a direct symptom of this desperation and chaos. It reflects these intense internal dogfights.
Lack of coordination.
Total lack of coordination, yeah. It shows how fragile the power structure is under all this pressure.
Okay, so given all that, was Khamenei's final no on the core demands? Was it inevitable?
According to this analysis, yes, probably. The negotiations were likely doomed from the start.
Why?
Because the source argues the regime, especially Khamenei, fundamentally cannot give up the nuclear program. It's seen as existential.
More important than ending the Iran-Iraq war, even.
Yeah.
The source mentions the poison chalice.
Yeah, that comparison is made. It suggests giving up the bomb is seen as even more unthinkable than that was for Khomeini. It's tied to their very survival, in their view.
Even if it costs trillions and doesn't guarantee anything.
Apparently so. And the source also notes that even what Shawkani did offer, those limited concessions, they weren't enough anyway.
For the U.S. and the Europeans.
Right. The E3 France, Germany, UK, and the European media reportedly said, we don't trust them anymore. We need a clear yes or no.
No more delays.
Exactly. The U.S. Secretary of State apparently said the same. The window for talks was closed, just needed an answer.
And Khamenei gave the definitive no.
That's how the source reads it. So you end up with a regime that's seen both its major strategic pillars get knocked back, proxies weaken, nuclear program facing impossible demands in under 2 years.
Leaving them, well,
very vulnerable, according to the source. Described as rotted, unbalanced, especially facing a population that's really at its limit.
okay, this picture of instability, it naturally leads to concerns that maybe concerns you, the listener, have about military action. The source acknowledges the country is like a hostage, right?
Yeah, that's a really important point. The source makes the people are hostages, and the concern about military strikes is understandable.
We see the military buildup, the deployments.
Right. The source mentioned the Pentagon sending advanced weapons, B-2s, B-52s, carrier groups. They say this isn't just for show.
But it doesn't necessarily mean a ground invasion.
That's the argument. Not a ground war, not widespread attacks on civilians. The source suggests it points more towards targeted strikes.
Aimed at what?
Military sites, nuclear facilities specifically.
Which is very different from the regime's own narrative.
Mm-hmm.
People like Salami talk about ground war.
Completely different. The source claims the regime wants people to fear a ground war, use it to maintain control, stir up nationalism or fear.
Interesting. The source also hinted some actions might have already happened. Quietly.
Yeah, they mentioned reports from last October suggesting Israeli jets might have taken out some Iranian air defenses without much noise.
Implying their defenses might not be as strong as they claim.
Potentially, yeah. It suggests targeted actions are possible and maybe already happening below the radar.
So if a full ground invasion isn't the likely or preferred path according to this source, what do the Iranian people themselves want in this analysis?
The assessment in the source material is that the preference is for political and economic pressure, not a military attack.
Like activating the trigger mechanism we talked about.
Exactly. That plus officially designating the IRGC as a terrorist group. The source notes the growing calls for this from the UK Parliament, EU Parliament, US, Canada.
And maintaining maximum pressure.
Yes, keeping that maximum pressure policy going.
And the argument is the regime is weaker now than during the first Trump maximum pressure phase?
Significantly weaker, yeah. That's the source's take. Because of the proxy issues, the economy being terrible, the lack of legitimacy, the internal fighting, all these factors make them much more vulnerable to pressure now than they were back in, say, 2016 to 2020.
Okay. Now, there's always this question, and it came up in the source material you sent. Does the U.S. administration actually get it? Do they understand the regime's tactics, the deception, the buying time? Specifically mentioned the Secretary of State also being the NSA advisor.
It's a really fair question. The source suggests a way to judge this is don't just listen to the words, look at the actions and the results. And based on the performance, the outcomes of the current U.S. diplomacy, the source argues their actions do suggest they understand the deceptive nature quite well.
How is that different from the past? The source mentioned John Kerry.
Yeah, they contrast it with Kerry after the 2015 deal. He reportedly went around Europe actively trying to convince big companies to invest in Iran, almost like a salesman for the regime's economy.
And the current admin isn't doing that.
Their actions suggest a very different approach, implying, according to the source, a deeper understanding of the regime's real game.
Let's talk about the role of the opposition, the organized resistance, MEK, NCRI. The source gives them a lot of credit.
A lot of credit. Described as extremely effective over many years in exposing the regime's secrets to the world.
Especially on the nuclear front.
Absolutely. The source highlights their role in revealing sites like Isfahan, Natanz, Fordo. These weren't just rumors, they provided actionable intelligence.
And there was a more recent one, Semnan province.
Yes, that revelation is flagged as particularly important recently. The source believes it was 100% influential and a real slap to Khamenei, really turning up the heat.
The source also points to international support as proof of their effectiveness. U.S. Congress resolutions, thousands of politicians worldwide.
Right. U.S. Resolution 116 is mentioned, point 5 supporting rebellious units inside Iran, and support from thousands of elected officials in like 30 countries.
And the argument is this support isn't just symbolic.
No, the source argues it's evidence of real credibility and a real connection inside Iran. These international figures, they apparently take risks supporting the resistance. It's linked to the fact that the resistance has people on the ground willing to risk everything to get information out. That gives them credibility.
Okay, shifting gears slightly to the media landscape. The source uses some really strong language here. Ayatollah BBC.
Yeah, very strong language. Damned colonial media. Most bastard censor in history. The claim is that certain outlets actively try to push the regime's agenda.
Now, what's the main accusation?
A key tactic, according to the source, is trying to undermine the organized resistance, specifically by spreading the idea that they have no popular support inside Iran.
No base.
Right. The source mentions BBC bringing people on recently to push exactly that narrative.
But the source pushes back hard on that.
Very hard, using basic logic, really. How does any group survive 60 years of brutal repression, grow, gain international recognition?
If they have no support.
Exactly. It doesn't make sense. The source points to the huge sacrifices. 120,000 martyrs mentioned the growth of these rebellious units despite constant arrests.
The source mentioned over 4,000 arrests of resistance members recently.
Yeah, 4,300 reported by the MEK. And the fact they consistently get highly sensitive intel out of the country, that requires a network, requires a base.
And events like the recent NCRI gathering, the UK Parliament letter with 560 signatures, these are presented as tangible proof of support linked to that base.
That's the argument. International figures don't just sign letters like that for fun. They see evidence of a real movement, despite the regime's propaganda and, reportedly, pressure from some media outlets.
This brings us to a specific question you raised in the material. How do you tell who might be linked to the regime's intelligence ministry? You mentioned names like Masih Alinejad, Hamid Esmarian as examples from the question.
Yeah, this is super tricky navigating all the different voices. The source offers a key principle here.
Which is?
Judge people by their actions and the results of those actions, not just their words or claims. What actually happens because of what they do.
Can you give an example from the source?
They point to things like the Galt House meeting or the Massa Charter Group during the 2022 uprising.
Okay.
The source argues that whatever the stated intention was unifying the opposition, maybe the actual outcome was that it took the focus off the streets, it sent the uprising back home, which they argue is exactly what the regime wanted at that moment.
So look at the result, not the stated aim. Any other potential flags mentioned?
Yes, small details sometimes, like Hamid Esmarian apparently having books published inside Iran despite the heavy censorship. The source suggests that's worth noting.
Contrasting that with the regime spending billions to demonize the MEK.
Exactly. Films, books, massive propaganda campaigns against the organized resistance. The source even shared an anecdote about getting a box of anti-Emmy copes delivered randomly to their London home, shows the regime's focus and reach.
And the old saying, tell me who your friends are.
That's suggested as a useful test, too. The source cites reports, for example, of an IRGC commander meeting with Reza Pahlavi, who associates with whom.
Any resources mentioned for tracking this?
The Iran Akshagar website is recommended by the source for documented info on alleged regime proxies and intelligence networks abroad.
And finally, this idea of coordinated behavior between media and certain figures.
Yeah, the source points to how quickly some outlets, like BBC and certain individuals, reacted to that UK Parliament letter supporting the resistance.
Faster than the regime itself?
Reportedly, yes. Before Iran's own parliament even reacted. The source links this pattern to what was allegedly planned for the 2018 bomb plot in Paris.
How so?
The plan apparently included having regime agents ready for TV interviews immediately after the bomb went off to spin the story. This kind of suspiciously fast, coordinated reaction, the source argues, can indicate a planned operation.
Wow, okay, that is a lot to process. Let's try to boil it down. Based on this whole deep dive into the source material, what are the main takeaways for you, the listener?
I think the core picture painted by the source is of a regime that's really feeling the pressure. It's cornered.
Facing defeats on multiple fronts.
Yeah, strategically.
Mm-hmm.
The proxy network is weakened. The nuclear program is facing demands it arguably can't meet. So they're desperate, trying to buy time against deadlines like the trigger mechanism.
While dealing with massive internal pressure, too.
Exactly. Economic hardship, potential uprisings. But the source suggests the consistent work of the organized resistance, combined with international pressure and these key revelations, is really exposing the regime's weaknesses and challenging its survival strategy.
And the key to understanding it all is focusing on actions and results.
That seems to be the most reliable guide, according to this analysis. Look at what people and groups do and what actually results from it, rather than just taking claims at face value.
That's a really powerful framework. Okay, here's a final thought for you to chew on, stemming from all this. Given this picture of desperation, strategic setbacks, and internal chaos, what kinds of new, maybe unexpected tactics or deceptions should we be watching out for from the regime as these pressures continue to mount?
That's definitely something to keep watching closely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.